It does this horrible weird thing. Sorry about that. Kind of.
Always.
Yeah. Okay. Should I start or how do you want to?
Please start.
Okay, so welcome to this program, which is part of the CMI Arts Initiative. So as many of you probably know, CMI stands for Chennai Mathematical Institute. So it's a little bit unusual that we have an arts initiative, I suppose. But this was a vision of Professor Seshadri, who started the institute, that he always wanted it to develop on all fronts. And about almost 10 years ago, it kind of was inaugurated in this format. In the form, I mean, we realized that we didn't have the volume to sustain a full-fledged humanities program in our institution, but we thought we should try to promote activities in and around the arts of different kinds for our students and also for the community at large. So we began with some weekend programs in 2012. And then in 2014, we embarked on a writer's residency in collaboration in Sangam House, through which we were hosting 2 international writers each year in January, February for 3 to 4 weeks, which became very successful. But unfortunately, that program had to be shelved this year. We got the last ones in just before the pandemic at the beginning of 2020. And then in between, we also built our auditorium. So we've had a few exceptional concerts and dance performances as well. And now in this new avatar of online, we decided to embark on these conversations with writers of different types. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Priya Sarukkai Chabria today. And I will hand over to Usha Mahadevan to make the official introduction. So welcome all, and I hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to Priya Sarukkai's reading. She's a prolific writer and a writer of many genres, a poet, translator, writer of fiction, and then of course, literary non-fiction, and an editor to boot. Some of her works include Andal, the autobiography of a goddess. We've been talking about it. It's a translation of the 30 Pasurams of Tirupavai, and she was just recollecting her journey through the translation. Then, of course, then we have today's program, Sing of a Life. It's a revisioning of Tagore's Gitanjali. Then Clone, a speculative fiction, and Mumbai Immersions, a non-fiction. Priya is well versed in Sanskrit aesthetics, that is the rasa theory, as well as the Tamil Sangam poetics. I think it's a fantastic combination. I really don't know how she manages it. She's the author of 9 books of poetry, the founding editor of poetry in Sangam House, and her poems are translated into Indian and European languages. This evening, Priya will talk on Sing of Life, revisiting Tagore's Gitanjali. She'll address issues like the following, like for instance, the necessity of reworking the classics, creativity and translation in the subcontinental practice, implications of wisdom and bhakti poetics in contemporary times, significance of eco-poetics and the climate amidst the climate breakdown, influence of Tagore's vision in Gitanjali. Well, delighted to have you with us, Priya, and we are looking forward to a very engaging discussion. Srilata.
Yeah, thank you. And welcome once again, Priya. Welcome to all of you. It's a real pleasure to have Priya with us today. So I would like to start, Priya, with your work and your engagement with the classics, with bhakti poetry, and your whole revisioning of them as poet and as translator, and the very new text that you have created out of that, out of your work. You know, just before we actually formally started this program, you were talking about your work with the poet Ravi Shankar and your translation of the songs of Andal, the 8th century Tamil poet, that went into your book, Andal, the autobiography of a goddess. Yes. So I was wondering if you would care to talk about the journey from Andal to Tagore and sort of like join the dots for us.
Thank you so much. I am honored to be on this platform. Thank you very much. And before I start, I do want to thank all the people behind my book, The Sing of Life. because this was produced at the time of the pandemic when it was very, during a very bad time. So not only is Karthika the fabulous editor and publisher of Context Book in Westland, I have to thank, but the marketing team, the graphics, and also all those people I do not know, whose names I do not know, who I will never see, the packers, the printers, the drivers, all these people who made sure that the book was there and into bookshops and online. They've also done a great work in these difficult times, and we were hiding. So really a great big thanks to them also. So to come to your question, Srilata, you had me thinking about this. I mean, the movement from Andal to Tagore, and of course, I have said that I consider Tagore of the Gitanjali a 20th century bhakti poet. But before that, just a couple of days ago, I found this tiny little book, which I had edited some 20 years ago, a little free pamphlet which we had done. And there I had written, as a poet, I know poetry is the dream speak of mortals. It is our shared secret of the sacred. So well before getting into, shall we say, bhakti poetry or the poet, I think the seeds were already there, because the keywords of being, poetry as visionary, and that it has to be shared and it's sacred, was already in place. And now we know that bhakti has, there are two margams, as it were. I mean, there are the saguna poets and the nirguna poets. And the saguna are the people who worship divinity as a form, as an Ishtadevata. And Andal, of course, falls in this category. She belongs everywhere, but she falls into this category. And what happened was that when I was translating Andal, of course, I had no idea. I'm a self-taught poet and writer. I had no idea about translation theory, but Andal here is a poet, 8th, 9th century, and she was working with the poetics of the Sangam era, which is about 2nd century BCE to 4th century CE. So what I did was I studied those poetics. I studied with scholars. I studied with people who could give me word-to-word translations. And the more I studied Sangam poetry, I was elated because it gave you a literal meaning, but it also gave you two other forms of meaning, a hidden and an insert meaning, which you have to pull out. And this to me it gave enormous freedom, both to the translator and also to the idea of bhakti, because, I mean, the mystics glow, as it were, or sparkle on the horizon of the liminal. How can you be sure? How can you authoritatively say this is what they meant? While Sangam poetics, with its 3 levels of meaning, already said, hello, this is there's one meaning, there's another, and there's a third. And this translator is making an approximation, is making a guess, is making really an intuition. And that was fundamentally important. Also, it helped us very much in the translation, because I was working with Ravi Shankar, who is this brilliant poet, Indian born, based in the US. He also works very fast. So before I could get a line of, my first line of Andal done, Ravi had sent in his 30 verses of the Tirupavai, already Andal's first book, first song, shall we say. And I looked at it, it was brilliant. But then I thought, my Andal doesn't speak in this way. She doesn't use this language. Her breath doesn't move like this. Now, what do we do with this? How can we amalgamate these two voices into one translation? But that is where Sangam poetics came into play, and the idea of bhakti, because you didn't need two voices. took the decision, right, we can have two separate translations running parallel, side by side. So you get his translation and you get my version. Both are there, which give you a multiplicity of andals, which I think is what I think translation could do. And this is, as I was saying, Sagun Bhakti. While Tagore, I have said, is a 20th century Nirgun poet, Bhakti poet, one who speaks about the divine, who is in a sense formless and everywhere, in everything. Now we also know that Tagore, it's a difficult thing to say because we know Tagore came from a Brahmo Samaj background, and the Brahmo Samajis believed in the Divine Father. But he also had studied the Upanishads, and we know the influence of the Baul mystics on his work. And the more I read his Gitanjali, I only read the English version, the more I found that there was life affirmation in spite of the darkness that he had gone through. He'd lost 5 of his family members in close succession while he was writing this, but a tremendous life affirmation, a tremendous sense of the imminence of grace in everything. A beauty which is magnificent, even in darkness, which is why I said, yes, he is this 20th century Bhakti poet. And I found that I was moving personally from a kind, an idea of a Sagun to a Nirgun sense of divinity. Because I was reading philosophies, and the idea of hylozoism, the philosophy that, all of life is animate, that appealed to me. And reading Tagore kind of reinforced that. So I could see that he was, that it would be good to call him here poet of the 20th century. For example, I'll just read a very short section from an extract from Song 22. He says, deep shadows of rainy July, morning has closed its eyes, a thick veil over the blue. Woodlands have hushed. Doors are shut. Solitary wayfarer, the gates are open in my house. Do not pass by like a dream. So here you do have the sense of the you, a person who is addressing it to, but expand it, and you will find, as I said, this reverence of life for everything. And it moved more and more when I think of climate breakdown and the havoc we've caused to the planet because of our ridiculous hierarchies. I move more and more to the idea of the sacred in everything, the everyday sacred, as it were. And also, I began to disagree rather violently with the idea of, the arrogance of us calling ourselves Homo sapiens, which means of people who know, when we know very well that until a couple of decades ago, we didn't know if there was anaerobic life. We didn't accept that animals, various other than human life forms, use tools. We didn't accept that trees actually communicate with each other. So this concept of arrogance was deeply off-putting when I came across another concept proposed by anthropologists of people calling people from the earliest people onwards as Homo spiritualis. That is, people who contemplate the nature of consciousness. And this appealed to me. And this again fed into my understanding and working with Tagore, because there you're talking about, again, the permeability of the invisible force of spirituality, you know, which is everywhere, non-hierarchical, which you find in Tagore. Does that kind of answer the question, Srilata?
Yes, yeah, it does. Thank you. Yeah, just to sort of switch gears a little, in Tagore's vision, the poet or the singer is really a medium through which the divine sings. It seems like a simple enough idea, but it occurred to me that it is actually quite distant from our own contemporary notions of authorship, of actually being a poet or a singer or a composer. Wondering how does this sit with your own identity and work as a poet, and also tell us a little bit about maybe the connections between your practice as a poet and your practice as a translator.
Well, to begin with, it sits very well. We often talk about the writing self that emerges, which is so much more brilliant and, imaginative than you are in your daily life. And you have this thread of, oh, did I really do it? Not only as, a scribble on a copper plate found in Ellora, but you have this all the time. I think with all writers, one of the most painful things to do is to try to describe what you've done with a book. That, as soon as you finished it, they want, you're supposed to know what you put in, and you do not know. Because so much is intuited, so much is slept over, dreamt over, and it comes through. So the idea of letting the intuition speak, which I think is close to the idea of the sacred, because is important to me. And also, let us be clear about what we mean by the sacred. We're not talking about the structures of religion. We're talking about the experience of a spirituality, right? And what does that do? It decenters one. That's a great gift. It connects you with everything around you. So when we have that going in, I think it becomes easy to connect with Tagore's words when he said, art is a response of man's creative soul to the call of the real. And you are always questioning what this real is and the implications of what you see around you. I mean, science will tell it to you in so many ways. We know that, we think we're sitting still, and we know that the earth is tunneling through space at a fantastic speed, and we're all spinning around wildly. So we really have to think about what we mean by the real. Therefore, yes, the idea of the sacred, the everyday sacred, as I put it. And coming to the practice of the poet and the translator, here again, I think they sit very close together, because we know that the invisible translator is a myth. There's no such thing. You are putting your ideas, your work through. It's like DNA, right? You get into a work and you're twinning around, and the voice that speaks is your voice and the voice of the original poet. So when you know this, it is not so difficult to find out to have these separate compartments. And here it reminds me, when I was much younger, I was, as a matter of fact, talking with C.S. Seshadri, who set up CMI. And I was asking him what is creativity in the sciences, and how do you go about it? And he, with his usual big laugh at that time, said, well, you have to work hard. You have to work very, very hard all that time. You have to keep on working hard. And then he said, you have to have wonder. You have to keep on having wonder. I mean, he spoke in these very, shall I say, emphatic yet open terms. And I found that was so close to art practice too. So we're not just talking about the commonalities between a poet and a translator, but the whole creative practice, whether it is the sciences or the arts. And you have, of course, speaking of wonder, you'll have Tagore saying, I found my garden full of wonders, for example, in the Gitanjali. You know, the connections are immense. But of course, there are differences too. I mean, in translation, it's like, you know, you take a piece of embroidery, you see it, and it looks so neat. Then what you do, you turn it on the reverse side. And there you see all the colored threads which are tying each little piece of the picture, as it were, together. The yellow dot on the northeast coming to the southwest corner, the thread running through. So we are, it's very much like deconstructing it in that way, like a piece of embroidery, seeing the connections. And yet not knowing, I think, fully, though especially with bhakti poetry, which I translate, you really don't know the end of the translated verse any more than you would as a poet. Each poem is a discovery. You don't know what you're going to reach at the end. Similarly, especially with bhakti poetry, I don't think one really can know what one is reaching. That is a commonality I found. And I mean, there is also, I think, a tremendous amount of research that goes into translation. And where do our poems come from? Also, often the research that we are doing, you know, poems spring from our reading around there. And both are a quest, and both are communion, not communication. You're communing with yourself, with the unknown reader, with the words in the text. So these were, I mean, the obvious parallels or connections one finds. And also a linked idea to this is, I think, the idea of content and form, you know, because you think that maybe you would think that you should translate in a certain way. Like maybe you earlier thought that you should write a poem in a certain way. And in my own journey as a poet, I found that initially when I began, I'd want to write a haiku, or I'd want to write a ghazal or a sonnet. You'd want to structure your poems in a way. And now I just don't think so. I think that the content invokes the form. So things are getting, I think both the processes are becoming much more intuitive for me. And as I said earlier about Sangam poetics, there is no idea of one way of saying it, you know. So you always have this multiplicity of meaning, the freedom of Kalpana Shakti, the power of the imagination. It isn't that you have to go either be truthful to the word or truthful to the spirit. It's an amalgamation of both. And I think there is also one other point. It's that where it can be very different, it is who are you translating? I mean, are you able to check back with the person? If you aren't able to check back, then you're again taking these leaps of faith, which is very much like poetry to me. Of course, the other, there's the reverse side. What if your work is getting translated into another language? And that would also depend on what is it getting translated into? Is it getting translated into song? Are you writing for, say, dance, as I used to for my sister, Malavika? In which case you give very little. The words are very few, but the resonance, the kind of trampoline effect that it can have, the way it can be interpreted through dance is multiple. So there are these factors, but overall, more commonalities than differences.
Yeah. And I was just also thinking, ultimately, I think the poem becomes its own thing. The translation, you sort of jump in, and it is such an intuitive process. And I'm glad you spoke about that. And some level, all your I think, worries about translation theory and doing the right thing and finding the exact right word, I think just sort of gets lost. And some other force, I think, takes over. Just like when you're working as a poet, I think that's probably what kind of happens.
Yeah, I just, it's just that that every poem you write, as it were, transforms you in a way.
That's right.
And that is what happens with translation too, right? You don't just dip into a person's work like a hot water heater and come out the same. You are transformed by the process.
Yeah.
And I know this has happened with Sing of Life for me with Tagore. So yeah, but you were saying?
Yeah, no. So I was just wondering, at this point, would you like to read to us maybe a favorite excerpt or a song that you particularly like from your rendering of Gitanjali from this book?
I would love to. I think what I'll do is, because this is about art and creativity, that's what we've been talking about. I think I'll read you 101, song 101 from the 103 songs of the Gitanjali. And as you know, I've done it in two sections. So I'll read you both. I have sought you with my songs. With them, I have searched and touched my world. They showed me secret paths, stars on the horizon of my heart. To what gate have they brought me at the end? The second part of the poem, the second poem. With my songs, I feel about searching, touching. Guide me to the mysteries. Tagore, talking about art.
Yes, really like
creativity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was thinking about your introduction to the book, to Sing of Life, and you talk about the whole serendipity of your entry into this amazing project, and you describe how you started to read the Gitanjali, which is translated into English by Tagore himself, how it was really quite a casual, accidental thing almost, and so on, and how your husband picked it off a cafe bookshelf or something. And
yes, very true.
Yeah, you're right about how, in your own words, how certain words from the songs lift like swans into your mind.
Yeah.
And the unprepared nature of it. It's really like an adventure, as are most books, I suppose. But when you think of Tagore, and I have I've tried to teach Tagore in class and so on, we typically tend to approach him with some trepidation, and sometimes when you read bad translations of his work, also with annoyance. And I think it's clear to us sometimes the whole mismatch between I think his gifts and what comes to us as non-Bengali readers. It's quite stark. And there is sometimes you wonder, was he really overrated? So there's all of that going on in your head. And I think in your introduction, you describe how you felt as a non-Bengali, like a bit of an outsider or an interloper, yes. Right? So I was wondering, Priya, if you could tell us how you went on to writing an entire book, a book that revisions the Gitanjali, was the fact of your being an outsider to this, sort of dominant Bengali discourse about Tagore, a strength in a sense. And what do you feel about gatekeeping practices that go on, especially when it comes to the classics or these canonical writers and so on, in terms of who gets to read them, who gets to interpret them or translate them, what constitutes really an authoritative translation, and so on?
Lovely, meaty questions, this. Thank you, Srilata. The thing is that as I mentioned, you have too, it was completely spontaneous. I read the book, and as I said, those words just lifted off. And so we were in this hill station of Bir, and I started working on it, immediately writing out whatever came to me. And I think about 2 months later, when I was halfway through the book, the first part of it, of my poems, I sent it to a friend to read. And he came back with, "Oh my God, you have taken on Gurudev. You have taken on this Nobel Prize winning book." And that is when I quaked, I must confess. And I said, I had never thought of it that way because you are just enchanted, you're just on a throne, you just go ahead. You can't stop yourself in a way. But I was, I think, too involved in the project, too much in love with the book. This time when I was reading it, so I continued. And you're right, my being a non-Bengali, I think is almost seminal to this project, because otherwise, when you hear him everywhere, as it were, and you hear his songs in Bangla all around, I'm sure that's very intimidating. So yes, that was, like I guess if I was living in Srivilliputur, I might have thought 10 times about translating Andal. But living away, the gift of distance is also important, besides the enchantment of the work. And you had talked about, I mean, about gatekeeping. As you know, it's very sad that Tagore started Vishwabharati University in Shantiniketan in 1921. And he wanted it to be an open university, India's wealth open to everyone, all who came in. But, you know, his own works were under copyright till 2001. And that's ironic. It's just that the dead are so helpless. You can imagine how terrible it was did he know about this? And it brings us also to the next part of your question, which is the authoritative or translation. Now, it's interesting to go back to where we think this idea came from. And of course, it comes from the 17th century, the translation of the St. James Bible by these 47 scholars who were translating it from, translating the Bible from the Greek and I think Hebrew and a few other languages, versions to make the authoritative Protestant St. James Bible, which has a majesty of language, which is, it is magnificent as a work of translation. And of course, it's at the bar. But it also gave us this idea of one translation, one authoritative translation. Now, in the subcontinent, luckily, I would say luckily, we have multiple versions of the same story, the same myth, whether it's classics, whether it's folk tales going around, in multiple languages, in multiple, and simultaneously, you know, and no one says one is fake because there is another in existence. We live with this plurality, which I think is a great strength of our tradition, and one that we shouldn't lose. So absolutely, for me, gatekeeping is an absolute no. It's also a little like, you know, on the one hand, you have gatekeeping, where access is blocked. And the other end of it, there is plagiarism. This literary pilfering of other people's material all lifelong without giving credit. And that is also horrible, because I think it's when you do that, you are being unfair not only to the original writer who you took it from, but also to your readers who might want to read that writer in the original and you have blocked. So both are dangerous terrains. And I think unless you have multiple versions, multiple translations, it will be the death of classics. And you know, in your own magnificent poems of them, which draw from the Mahabharata, when you've spoken about, you've done a feminist retelling, folks go and read poetry at Sangam, hit the site, hit Sri Lata's page and read her new work on the Mahabharata. It's magnificent. So when you get there, you know, we're on the same page, because again, we are retelling the stories, we're filling the silences, we are taking off in different directions. because we know each age has its own predictions, its own biases. This happens, and we have to make it live. Else, we are letting it actually die. And there's also this idea, which is important for me, with gatekeeping and plagiarism, which is, they say, khali haath aata hai, khali haath jata hai. You come into life empty-handed, you leave empty-handed. But what do you leave behind? That is the question, isn't it? And there, I think it is important to share as much as you can of what you love. Else, it's not what you love. It's what you want to control. So, but I mean, and I think it's commonly understood that every generation needs a new translation, though of course the original will continue to inspire. And I agree. I mean, reading bad translations is like it's a stumbling block. By the way, I was recently reading that Tagore was extremely diffident about his English. And the amount of people he wrote to saying, I don't know if I should translate. And yet he did, because he felt compelled at a certain point of time. The joy of translation was too much for him, so he went ahead. So there is this. I can understand the bad translations, but hopefully I think there are many more coming out, which is cause for celebration. And my heart goes out to you for having to deal with bad translations and teach them to.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So so speaking of translation, so how did you work towards reshaping Tagore's own translation of his Gitanjali? And I think in your introduction, you do speak of how you took this decision not to alter his word order, not to substitute words, and how you decided to, for instance, stay with the present tense in order to honor the work's energy, right?
Yes.
If you could tell us a little bit more about your translation practice and the craft, how did you deal with the archaisms of the original Tagore translation, for instance, or also, maybe if you could speak a little bit about the spaces between the words, the absence of punctuation in your version. And you also, I think, say something about Tagore's own theories on translation. And did you have any role models, or did you practice? I mean, I think you said that already, that your practice was something that evolved organically, but I was just curious.
Yes. Well, this is it, right? When you are a self-taught translator, you don't have so many, I mean, you don't have the translation theories. You have to more or less create them, but that doesn't mean you don't read good translators. And Carson is one who comes to mind. I mean, there's so many translators, so I shan't name anymore. But this work, I don't keep a word of the Bengali. I don't keep Bangla at all. So I never read the original. I've only read Tagore's translations of the Gitanjali, which he did. So this book, Sing of Life, is a translation. It's also a palimpsest in that Tagore wrote over his own work, and there I was writing over that in a sense. And also, of course, it's a collage, because I have chosen certain words in a certain order. I've also had them floating across the page. So when I first read Tagore, I think as a lot of us did in school, I was not very impressed. It was, as you said, the ornatism, heavy language, and you say, oh my God, now what is there? But there was always a beautiful turn of phrase. But the entire weightiness used to put me off. I think there is this, as they say, there's a time to sow and a time to reap. There is also an idea of, for me, darshan you have with the book. You are open to receiving the book at that moment in time. And I think the book also seems to invite you in. There are certain books that, and when there is this wonderful mutuality, as it were, of vision, when you meet, then that is when the real excitement, the enchantment of literature kind of spirals out and catches you in it. So how did I work on these poems? I read the Gita. As I was reading each poem, I started translating each one. And you're quite right, I decided that I would not change his word order. I would not insert any of my words. It's a tribute. I would not insert any of his words. But I did change the thou and thee, those kind of heavy pronouns, into you, the simple, intimate you. Also, which comes from my bhakti practice, because there is this intimacy of address. So that is, I think, and I worked in the present tense, as you have mentioned. I worked in more or less in sequence completely. I finished all the 103 poems of the Gitanjali. And then when I went back, I found there were more poems swimming in there. There were more possibilities. So I started taking what I call these remaining poems, which kind of floated on the page. And these were like, what shall I say? These are almost like footsteps of his thoughts, on the page, treading across in the shapes they took. So there were a lot of spaces in between the poems. And why do we use the spaces? We use the spaces to suggest silence, to suggest reflection. And similarly, why do you do away with punctuation? For me, what do we do with punctuation? Where we guide the reader, right? A comma, take a little pause, semicolon, okay, it's a bigger pause. Full stop, new thought arising. What happens when you remove the punctuations? The reader has to make it much more their own. They get into it, I think, in a much deeper way. It is the movement of their breath which comes in. And this has been seminal. This has been very, very, very important for me since I first started writing, which was in the last millennium, by the way. So, at the end of the last millennium, the reader has to come in and finish the text. And there's an intentionality which has been built in, which one is not always aware of, but one goes into this mode where there is maximum freedom for the reader to come in and interact with the poems and make it their own. Could I just read a very small extract? For example, this is extract from Song 1. I don't keep the Bengali. Someone asked that question. I don't keep the Bengali, but here it is from Song 1. This is Tagore. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages pass and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. Which becomes, in my version, gifts come to these small hands of mine. Ages pass and still you pour. Still there is room to fill. So I think there is an intensification of the emotion which is happening, a chiseling which is happening, and at the same time, there are the spaces which again tie up with the idea, one of reader intervention, the other is not having an authoritative version. The spaces allow, it's, I think, a little like Chinese painting, maybe, when there is all this space there. It's not that there's nothing there. The viewer comes in and fills it in. Like, similarly, I think with silences, you slow the reader, but you also give them space. And the sacred, I think, needs the spaces of the imagination, the spaces of the heart. Sridaya, the mindfulness of the heart to come in and fill up those spaces. So, and also another point which I think is very important is at the end of this book, we have Tagore's Gitanjali in the way he had written it. And this is where it's wonderful to have a wonderful editor like V.K. Karthika, who immediately, so agreed and pushed the idea too in her way, while to have this Tagore's original at the end of the book. Because immediately the reader can compare and make their poems. In a sense, maybe they want to make more poems out of it. Maybe they just want to take it and run because I've deconstructed how I do it. Now it's yours. That was important. Now, and why I could, I think, take all these liberties also was, as I was reading later, Tagore's translation practices are phenomenal for his time. At a time when people thought of, translation as a tool for learning languages, he already saw it as a creative practice. The beginnings of translation theory are there. And he's also often written to his publisher saying, I will not translate, I will rewrite this. Macmillan's was his publisher. That is, again, gives you as a person entering the text, it validates you. He fused poems. And it's also interesting that, this translation of the Gitanjali is not the first. It's the first complete one. But some of his friends like Ananda Kumaraswamy or Sister Nivedita, all the important intellectuals of and art historians of the period, they apparently translated a few verses, but they did it in meter. And Tagore writes, I don't think my poems can be translated in meter. I think they will be better as prose. I mean, that is uncanny, his understanding of how his work should be. And then, of course, we know what happened later with his work, and we can speak about it a little more. But I would like to read to you one beautiful idea he wrote about to his perhaps favorite niece. This he writes in 1894, okay? He's writing to his niece Indra Devi Chaudhary Rani from Bolapur. And he says, we know people only in dotted outlines. That is to say, with gaps in our knowledge, which we have to fill in ourselves as best as we can. Thus, even those we know well are largely made up of our imaginations. But perhaps it is these very loopholes that allow entrance to each other's imagination. That is such a beautiful thought. To me, a very significant and profoundly moving thought. And this man is writing it, Gurudev is writing it more than 100 years ago. So basically, I think a text which is as rich and as mystical as the Gitanjali offers its silences, offers its gifts to the reader, which they have to fill out. And that's what I think I've done with my book. Yeah?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so this is kind of connected question, I guess, and you've already spoken about some of this, but you actually talk about how you first thought of these poems as erasure poems. And in fact, I'm just going to quote you from your introduction. You say, though erasure is a form of contained writing, its reductionist connotations did not agree with me, for mine is a tribute. Besides, I believe a great poem is one that often serves as a draft or raft for someone else's poem, or that is how it should be, a spark or a shift in another subconscious. So have you, in a way, sort of abandoned that initial understanding of these as being erasure poems? And it really seems to me from reading your rendering side by side with Tagore's own translation, both of which are there in this book, like there is certainly an element of erasure in how you've approached it. So wondering what you...
I mean, technically you're absolutely right, because erasure, well, what would we call an erasure poem? That is one which has edited out 50% of the words. And definitely my version has less than 50% of Tagore's English Gitanjali. On the other hand, erasure, when we think of erasure poems, we think of these pages with all these blackouts, don't we, of, inked out blocks of sentences and paragraphs. And and the idea is, why are you doing that? You reclaim language, of course. Through that, you are writing back to the oppressor by taking his words and erasing many parts of it, so that certain parts, the significant parts which are important to you, come out. And or even with written histories, you do this. Also, I think sometimes you want to repay violence with violence. You take the text and you want to mangle it because it has been so detrimental to your community, to yourself. But my intentionality, this is why I say it's not erasure, is tribute. It's the opposite. Therefore, no, I will not call it erasure. And it is, the Gitanjali is a great text, a great poem of love. And I don't think spirituality is erased. You try to enhance, build it up, show it by cutting away the ornateness and the ornamentalism, show it up. Therefore, no, not erasure.
Right. Take your cue. Yeah. Okay. So I was, wondering, before we sort of maybe break for questions and so on, if you would care to read to us one or two songs from Tagore's translation alongside your own reading. I mean, I could read the Tagore translation as you wanted me to, if you like, just so the audience gets a sense of how you really reshaped the text. What is it exactly that you've done? No? I was really struck by how different your translations look on the page, their visual shape, syntax, how it sounds, and so on. So yeah, so if you would like to do that, maybe we could just pick one or two.
I would love to. And why don't we start with what we've all read in school? I mean, the 35, yes, where the mind, because he's writing it as a kind of a secular prayer. I think the Bengali title he gave for this was Prarthana, as simple as that. And it ties up with the Zen monk D.T. Suzuki referring to this as secularized spirituality. And this is a poem where, you have reason is not the opposition of faith. And Tagore's hope that from an inner being, inner moral ethics, morality, the whole nation will change is, shall we say, touching. So we'll go to 35.
Yeah.
35.
So should I?
Please, if you could read. Yeah, please, Srila.
Yeah. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by these into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
It's a beautiful poem. So what I did was I took as every poem every one of Tagore's prose poems, as I said, gets broken up into two poems. So I took the last line, and that is my first poem, just one line. into freedom, let my country awake. The second one, which spills across the page, as I think like footprints or a breeze blowing the words maybe, is, may the mind be without fear, knowledge free, world not broken, words come from truth, reason not lose its way, mind be led to ever widening thought and action. Now, open it out. And shall we go to another, which is also a kind of a bit of a favorite of mine, and that would be 59, which I think speaks a lot about Tagore. I mean, his view, his way of life, his attitude towards all of life, actually. So could you read 59?
Sure. Yes, I know. This is nothing but thy love, O beloved of my heart. This golden light that dances upon the leaves, these idle clouds sailing across the sky, this passing breeze leaving its coolness upon my forehead. The morning light has flooded my eyes. This is thy message to my heart. Thy face is bent from above. Thy eyes look down on my eyes, and my heart has touched thy feet.
Okay. 59. There is nothing but love. This light, these clouds, this breeze on my forehead, light floods my eyes, bends from above, looks down on my eyes. This is your message. I just think the idea of Samadarshan, where it's Samadarshan, the leveling gaze of love, which is so important in bhakti poetry and also very significant for Tagore, comes through here very strongly. Yeah, everything seems to be just glowing with grace and this immense love. Then,
yeah, maybe just one quick question, and I think we will have the audience sort of coming in.
Yeah.
In so many ways, the Gitanjali is a work of eco-poetics, and Tagore, we all know, is celebrated for being a nature poet. So I was wondering, if you could tell us a little bit about that, and maybe read a few, one or two songs to even illustrate this aspect of his work.
Yeah, I mean, yes, he was a nature poet. Eco-poetics is actually technically here, we're talking tech talk again, when it is a response of the Anthropocene to nature, right? So definitely, I think he was anxious about industrialization. He didn't agree with all that. But the great harmony that you see, the concepts of Ritu and Rita. Ritu, as you know, is the cyclic seasons, and Rita, which is the ordering principle of the cosmos that applies to everything, whether it's an atom or a galaxy. I think he believed in this harmony, which is existent, and wanted to align himself with it. And his poems reflect it very much. And today, I mean, you also think of where Tagore was writing all these poems. He was writing it high up in the mountains when his favorite daughter was unwell, listening to the rain falling. He was writing it on along the bed, or I mean, on the river Padma as he was going in his houseboat. So you have this again and again, the idea of nature. Maybe I have time to read one, or do I have time to read two?
You can read two, I think. We have.
Yeah, then I'll just end off with this and then we'll throw it open to questions. You know, I think he kept on experiencing the decentering of the self in nature. And that comes through everywhere. Now I'm trying to get to 81. Is 81. I grieve over lost time, but it is never lost. Take every moment of my life. Hidden in the heart of things, seeds sprout, buds blossom, ripening flowers, fruit. I was sleeping and imagined work had ceased. In the morning, I found my garden full of wonders. I awoke. And maybe one more, which is again, you know, nature poetry, samadarshan, all of it. 69. The same stream of life that runs through my veins runs through the world. The same life that shoots through dust and blades of grass and breaks into leaves and flowers. The same life is rocked in the ocean cradle of birth and death. My limbs are made glorious by its touch. My pride is the life throb dancing. Second point, the same life, the same life, the same life in my blood. Tagore.
Lovely, thank you.
So, thank you.
Should we throw this open for questions then? Does the audience have questions? You can either put it in the chat box or unmute yourselves. Thank you, Priya.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes, yes. Sure.
So, Priya, I had a few observations to offer and followed by a question, if that's all right. You clearly demonstrate that translation is so way beyond any kind of just mere semantic competence. In fact, you almost have to have a kind of a meta-linguistic ability. And now Mahmoud Darwish pointed out that the translator becomes the author of a web of relations that spring from the work. And I think from this conversation, I gleaned exactly that about you. And my personal response to you, actually, I encountered you through your words. Your words had become beings.
Thank you.
I sense why I was so drawn is I sensed a dispositional tendency towards a kind of primordial ontology, just through the way you deliver your words, the kind of dream speak that you started off with. And I think you well know my response was synesthetic. It involved all my senses. Which brings me to my question. I wanted to use a phrase by John Berger. He speaks about the enigma of visibility. I want to know, now you know the visible persona of Tagore is quite, impressive. And did you, when you speak of, say, a solitary wayfarer, do you not think of Tagore himself? And when you approached Andal, she is visible to you only as someone concocted by your own imagination. So I want you to hear about your more about your connection to the two when you transcribed what they had to say. When you see a person or a persona, there's a different dynamic. There seems to be an internal conversation. Whereas when the person is now relegated to being a spirit, is that a more intimate experience? I just wanted some comments.
Right. it's a lovely interpretation to think of the solitary wayfarer as Tagore himself. And that is a way of interpreting. I mean, and at another time, he speaks about the lute player on a river. And you wonder who is the lute player, and is Tagore the music, the flute player, sorry, is he the music, is he the flute? Who is what in this amazingly mystical, if you want, observation on life, which on the face of it seems almost descriptive. Andal is represented, we have dance dramas, we have Tagore paintings, we have temples full of her sculptures, we have Utsava murtis, we have representation after representation after representation of her. So she is, I mean, we don't have, with Tagore we had the photographs, but here we have generations and centuries of people envisioning Andal. So she's definitely not a spirit to me, in the sense that when I began thinking about her, and I think what comes through in my book on Andal is, she is a very young girl. She is about 15. The needs of her bodies are very clear in Nachar Tirumure, which does not make her not sacred. Her body is the site of the sacred. It is what she is, this girl of 15, who later becomes a goddess a couple of centuries down, is an incredible, she has this incredible, almost superhuman yearning to be one with the divine. And it is both, it is corporal. So when she speaks about her breasts or her long, beautiful hair, she knows she's very beautiful, or beautiful curved eyebrows, she is bringing in the physicality there. At the same time, there is this fiery, passionate core of her bhakti, of her devotion, which you can never miss. So one is, as it were, I won't even say they are DNA, I'd say it's the same, one and the same thing for Andal. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Priya, I'd also like to ask a question on Andal as well as Tagore.
Yeah, for sure.
Posing them, I feel that one talks of a very personal God and the other an impersonal one. So translating them, did you have to adopt different mindsets, or was one easier than the other?
See, both put, I would not say one was easier than the other. I would definitely, Andal took me much longer because I was learning some Sangam poetics, learning all of it to understand the depths of her thought. And I know, well, maybe, it was, each time I think of Andal, I go into, shall I say, a slight tizzy, because she is absolutely enchanting. You cannot but be in the thrall of this person who was, as a girl, managed to put in so much into such few words. You know, the sound of classical Tamar, it's like, it reminds me of temple gopurams, you know, all the rounded sounds. It's full of sculptures, and that is one way, the orality of approaching Andal on the literal level. But then you go deeper and deeper, and you find the various other levels there. And I think for her, Sri Krishna or Vishnu, Narayana, who she often talks about even in Kanakanda in the Tori, I dreamt this dream. He is he's embodied in her mind, very much embodied. And you see, when you go to, I remember this happened to me once, one evening at Srivilliputtur, we'd driven out to this lovely rock face, and the sun was just coming out, rising above. One of Andal's songs talks about his dark face in Nachar Tirumuri and the great dazzling body of his. And I said, she probably just saw, it was a wonderful moment for me. I said, maybe she saw she was standing somewhere where I was standing so many centuries ago, at a time like this when the sun was up and dazzling, and there was the huge shoulder of rock. And there was her God for her, because, she saw him everywhere, right? So that is Andal. Now, with Tagore, as I said, the more I read him, or the more you change during a work. And the person you're translating or working with also changes. And I saw Tagore's need for grace, his need to provide solace also to others after what he'd gone through, was also immensely supportive to me. I didn't begin working I began working on Song of Life before the pandemic, but all through for the first year of the pandemic, I was with Tagore. And that sense of grace which overflowed from his work, I think definitely helped me. And therefore, and I know that people have written in saying, we find this book gives us solace. So that has been very heartening. Yeah. Does that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions? Others have questions?
I thought there was a question in the chat also, asking.
Oh yeah, there is one now. Deepa. Yeah.
Do you see clouds wrapping? Oh, what is the question? Can you give it to me, please? I mean, I saw part of it.
The question is, do you see the clouds wrapping the sky? Flocks of cranes fly up from the further riverbank and fitful gusts of wind rush over the heath. What's the question, Deepa? Oh, I think, yeah, Deepa, could you mute yourself?
Well, shall I? Yeah. Yes, I see clouds drifting. I see light which is dazzling. I see cranes flying home, and the river sparkling slow and steady as it flows. So if we are ending this session, Srilata, I would like to read one poem which has flocks of cranes.
Right. Yeah.
Could I do that?
So I have one question. I'll just ask you one question. Yeah.
Yes.
So after you translated Tagore, did you sort of feel not translate, after you did this project on Tagore, did you really how was your sort of did you feel despondent that despite somebody warning the entire humanity in some sense of what could be in what could come in store, what could happen, and so on, we don't seem to have really learned. Yeah? So there is so do you did it? My question is, do you see hope, or do you feel it is rather hopeless because things have really not moved on with 100 years.
I mean, in the dark times, I don't think we sing about the dark times. I think we sing about the light. And because there's climate breakdown, there is increased authoritarianism, you name it, and it seems, and it is awful what is happening around us. And, you know, you have to think of the other than human lives that we are treating so poorly, the extinctions happening. You have to think of the general morass and and the fact that we're being lousy ancestors. All that kept in mind. I think there is always, as long as we live, there is hope. I think as long as there is, I think more and more people seem to be waking up to the idea that we have to change, possibly because of climate breakdown, their houses have been swept away or something like that. But I think there are on many areas, very small changes, but there are happening. And if we don't have the visionaries, where would we be? Would you agree with me on that?
I would, but there have been visionaries over the past 100 years, certainly. And of course, there have been great achievements also. One does not deny that. Even, I'm not talking about scientific achievements or things like that. I mean, even in terms of human rights and so on, we have, of course, made remarkable progress over the past 100 years. But so my question was more about your personal feeling of whether at the end of all the work that you put in, you came out far more hopeful, or
let me put it this way. Of course, there is, you know, when there's so much beauty which comes into one's life, there is going to be a sense of gratitude, immense gratitude, which has definitely happened in my life. And I think working on this book has also given me, makes me think of other people or other forms of life, their consciousness much more, you know? So it might be someone else in a mass driving to work in the car next to mine. But I think I'm questioning that often. What would that person be thinking? Or a little squirrel running across in the tree you might have seen earlier. What is it, you know, what is its state of mind? What does it have? How does it see the world? I'm much more interested in consciousness and know that our place is not unique. And that, I think, is also hopeful.
Yes, certainly.
So, thank you for your question. So, should I read that poem now?
Do you want to read the poem? Yes.
Yeah, I'll read that. This happens to be the last poem, 103. And again, in two parts. So I'll read the first part, pause and read the second. In one salutation, let my senses spread out and touch this world. Let my mind bend in one salutation. Let my songs gather and flow to a sea of silence in one salutation. Like a flock of homesick cranes flying back, let my life take to its eternal home in one salutation. Like a rain cloud hung low, shed showers. Let my life take its voyage to you. Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks, Priya, for a wonderful session. And thanks for being with us. Thank you all in the audience for having joined us. Thanks, of course, to Srilata for having coordinated this whole conversation, and Usha for the introduction. So we hope to see you for whatever events are coming up. So we will try to announce them and keep you informed. And hope you all have a wonderful evening after this. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, there is that little link I've shared in the chat box if you want to look up our programs and what we have done so far.
Yeah, and by the way, there will be a recording of this also put up for in case people joined late and missed a bit of it. Then you can, or you want to share it with friends. It should be up in a few days for you to see.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you. Lovely.
Thank you.
Bye, Priya.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye. Thank you.